Hey guys, it's Tyken here. I'm back with another video for you, so let's dive right in. Oh, and don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment. Let me know which manhwa you want to see next. Let's go!
The night was silent over a battlefield. Under the moonlight, it seemed the war had finally ended. But then, a command echoed through the forest. The order was to attack and take down the demon. Someone moved with speed, stopping abruptly. The white-haired youth, Nock von Reinhofer, realized the trap, but it was too late. The spear came from one of his own comrades. Nock dodged by a hair, the betrayal now clear as day. He glared at the night, but the real danger was forming in the skies. A dark force was about to be summoned, and then the rain of unholy energy fell upon him. The attack wasn't to injure him, it was to annihilate him completely. Amidst the chaos, Nock saw his allies standing, just watching. None of them lifted a finger to help. One of the attacks finally hit him head-on. The pain of the dark magic burned his body. He was hurled against the ground with crushing force. The ensuing explosion was enough to sweep away everything around it. The knight, however, remained intact, watching the result of his plan. Only the power released was too great. The energy began to consume the very knights who had cornered him. On his knees and powerless, Nock could only watch the destruction. He could barely breathe, and amidst the silence that followed, the accusations echoed. They called him a traitor, one who made a pact with the devil. Despite being exhausted and covered in wounds, Nock von Reinhofer heard the accusation. He was at his limit, but the fight wasn't over yet. With his hand firm on the hilt of his weapon, he prepared for what was to come. The dark creatures that surrounded him were the proof his enemies needed to justify the attack. But the truth was different. He needed a moment to catch his breath. The betrayal of his comrades weighed more than any wound on his body. And then, before him, arose the imposing figure of a former ally. The size difference was absurd, but Nock showed no fear. Her voice echoed across the battlefield, wanting to know why he had made that decision. To her, the answer was obvious. She accused him of making a pact with the devil, of betraying them all. She shouted his full name, as if she couldn't believe that the man in front of her was the same Nock she once knew. Nock heard the word betrayal and looked up at the sky, almost as if seeking an answer to such injustice. But the only answer he found was a bitter smile. The irony of the situation was too great to be ignored. He turned to face her, ready to finally correct the story they were telling. Nock then reversed the accusation. He said he never betrayed them. In fact, they betrayed him first. With his truth spoken, there was nothing more to be done in that place. Suddenly, an intense light took over everything, and a system message appeared. He had completed the first part of Inner Lunatic. That was his 27th time. But victory in the game didn't change reality. Outside the screen, Yu-chan's life continued the same, a cycle of frustration and sleepless nights, trying to find a way out that didn't exist. The only thing that kept him awake was nicotine, a desperate attempt to ward off fatigue and the truth about his condition. In the virtual world, he was a hero. He had solved the greatest mysteries and defeated the most powerful enemies. A master who had already completed everything possible in the game. But this whole story began to fall apart 2 years earlier, with a diagnosis that would change his life forever. That day, the doctor asked him to remain calm and just listen. He explained that despite all the tests, the results were always the same. There was nothing to be done. In that instant, Yu-chan's world stopped. The news was devastating, a blow from which he didn't know if he could recover. Alone, he stared at the paper that sealed his fate. There was no cure, no hope, just a sentence. He had already been to several hospitals seeking a second opinion, anything that could change what he already knew. But the answer was always the same, and the despair only increased with each consultation. His worst nightmare had become real. His body trembled, unable to process the dimension of that reality. Death was no longer a distant possibility, it was a certainty. The only solution medicine could offer was a bottle of painkillers, a palliative for when the pain became unbearable. But at that moment, even that seemed useless. He dropped the bottle, a gesture of complete resignation in the face of the inevitable. Back to the present. 2 years had already passed. 2 years living with that sentence, waiting for the end. The game was his only refuge, a world where he could be strong, where he could win. But with each victory, reality became more bitter, and his body wouldn't let him forget. The disease was there, present, reminding him that his time was running out, no matter how many times he beat the game. Suddenly, a violent cough hit him. It was the physical and undeniable reminder that his condition wasn't just a diagnosis on paper. The taste of iron in his mouth confirmed his worst suspicions. The disease was progressing, and there was nothing he could do. Trying to compose himself, Yoo-chan Kim wiped his mouth, but the feeling of weakness and fear persisted. Each day was a battle against his own body. That's when his cell phone vibrated on the table, breaking the heavy silence of the room. He picked up the device, already imagining what it would be. The notification on the screen was from the university hospital, confirming another appointment. Another cold, impersonal reminder of his inescapable reality. A tired sigh escaped him. It was an endless cycle of hospitals, exams, and bad news. On the table, a stack of medical papers seemed to stare at him. They were the material evidence of his sentence. In a fit of rage and frustration, he crumpled the documents. A useless gesture, but it was the only way to vent the helplessness he felt. Leaning on the table, panting, the energy drained as quickly as it came, leaving only despair behind. He thought he was already used to the idea of death, but facing the end head-on was different. The irony was cruel. He, with a terminal illness, and even his character in the game shared a similar fate. In front of the inner lunatic screen, the question arose once again. Start a new game? It was the only escape he had left. Without hesitation, the cursor moved to the only possible answer. Yes, the system asked for the player's name. He wouldn't use his own. In that world, he wouldn't be Yoo-chan Kim, the sick man. He would be someone else. Sweat ran down his face. The terminal illness was consuming him, and the only thing left for him to do was dive back into the game. It was time to create a new character, a new life. The character creation screen shone before him, offering a new beginning. The system presented 2 trait options: genius in mana sensitivity or genius in fencing and combat, a choice that would define his entire future in the game. But he didn't want to choose just one. A daring thought crossed his mind. What if he could have both? With his hand on the mouse, he prepared to attempt the impossible. He chuckled softly, aware of the madness he was about to commit. The system asked to choose one, but he wanted everything. Suddenly, an intense light exploded from the screen, catching him completely by surprise. The light enveloped him, and he felt a strange force pulling him into the game. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was thrown back in his chair, losing consciousness as the real world disappeared. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his room. He was in a luxurious place, in a body that wasn't his, and a mysterious message floated in front of him. The message said that he wouldn't remember who sent it, but that something needed to be said. A warning from an unknown sender. Confusion took over him. What did that mean? Who was talking to him? The reality of the situation began to sink in. He wasn't playing anymore. Somehow he had become the character, and then a new window appeared with a sinister greeting. Welcome back. What do you mean back? This was his first time in that body. Meanwhile, in the world he left behind, life went on. oblivious to the young man who had just disappeared into a game. The mysterious voice instructed him to stay close to the main storyline, but the first question that came to Nock's mind was another. What place was this anyway? It started to dawn on him. Cold sweat ran down as he tried to process the gravity of his new reality. He clenched his fist, forcing himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't get him anywhere. Nock needed to think clearly. If this was real, he needed a plan to survive. Memories of the game began to surface. The first major goal was clear: enter the Elydian Academy. There, he was supposed to follow the protagonist, help him grow in power, and stay true to the original story. It was the path laid out by the game, but following the main story meant one thing. For the character he now inhabited, it was a death sentence. The headache came on strong. The idea of simply following the script to his own end was unbearable. He looked at himself in the mirror, and the truth hit him like a punch. He had transmigrated into the body of the final boss of the game, Inner Lunatic. His character's fate was to be defeated. He was the villain who existed only to be overcome by the hero. But Nock couldn't simply accept that. There was something much more important at stake. He needed to recover his lost memories. That was his true goal, and he wouldn't give it up no matter the cost. A new determination took hold of the young man. If the world wanted a villain, he would have to use that role to his advantage. The path would be bloody and lonely, and if to find his memories he needed to become the greatest villain that world had ever seen, then so be it. And so, after his decision, the scenery changed. He was back in a world he knew, but in a different place. The cycle was about to begin again. Alone in a luxurious room, Nock reflected on what awaited him. He let out a sigh, trying to mentally prepare himself for what was to come. The system then questioned him, asking if he was ready to start the 28th attempt. With a determined smile, Nock accepted his fate once more. However, the first challenge appeared unexpectedly. By simply leaning on a piece of furniture, a sharp and sudden pain shot through his wrist, as if his bones were made of glass. Nock was shocked by the fragility of his new body. A system notification confirmed the problem. A negative trait was in effect, and he had sprained his wrist with minimal effort. Holding his sore hand, he began to walk down the hallway. Each step was a reminder of how pathetically weak he was in this new life. It was then that, as he turned, he ended up bumping into one of the mansion's maids. The dishes she was carrying shattered on the floor. The girl fell amidst the shards, completely surprised by the collision and not understanding who had bumped into her. The scene drew the attention of the other employees, but the real problem wasn't the maid. The slight impact made Nock recoil with unbearable pain in his chest. He realized that the body he inhabited was not only weak, it was that of the family trash. The situation was more complicated than he imagined. Nock was in the body of the family trash, and any slip-up, no matter how small, could become a gigantic problem. The maid panicked on the floor, surrounded by the shards. She wasn't crying over the broken dishes, but rather out of fear of what would happen to her because of the accident. In her head, she remembered why she was so terrified. The former owner of that body had a terrible habit of punishing employees severely for any mistake. Therefore, the girl simply cowered and prepared for the worst, waiting for the punishment that would certainly come for her carelessness. But, to her surprise, Nock approached with a gentle smile. His reaction was so unexpected that it made her even more nervous and confused. Only suddenly, his tone changed completely. With a dark look, Nock warned her never to repeat a mistake like that again. The maid burst into tears, but not from fear. They were tears of relief. She expected physical punishment, but all she received was a verbal warning. Her reaction took Nock by surprise. He couldn't understand why a stern warning would result in so much relief. The other employees, who were watching from afar, were also in shock. No one expected the young master to act so restrained. Nock then realized what he needed to do. To survive in that weak body and in that hostile family, he needed to get stronger and as quickly as possible. He turned and announced that he was going to the training hall. And, to everyone's astonishment, he ordered the maid to follow him. The order left the girl and the other employees completely speechless. No one could understand what he intended to do. Nock just kept a smile on his face, which only increased the confusion and fear about what was to come. As she followed him, the maid's mind raced. She feared that he was taking her to the training hall to punish her away from the eyes of others, perhaps with a wooden sword. Without saying anything else, Nock guided her through the corridors of the mansion. The destination was the training hall, but the purpose of that order was still a terrifying mystery to the young woman. The maid followed him, still terrified and not understanding what was happening. The fear of what Nock could do to her in the training hall was all she could think about. But Nock wasn't focused on her. After facing death up close, he was sure of one thing. He needed to survive at any cost and quickly adapt to this new reality. The memory of the pain and betrayal he suffered was still recent, a wound that constantly reminded him of what was at stake. He looked at the familiar landscape of the mansion. Despite the desperate situation, he knew he wasn't without hope. There was a chance. After all, he was a professional. He had beaten this game 27 times and knew every corner, every secret, and every flaw in this world. The maid watched from afar, increasingly confused by the young master's behavior, who seemed to be muttering things to himself. He not only knew the secrets, but also mastered the mechanics of the game. Inner lunatic! He knew exactly how the system worked. He remembered that the game focused on the conflict with the Empire, and that the key to power was the characteristic window. It was a world where the demonic and the divine clashed, and where the path to the top was defined by complex choices and combinations of abilities. The system allowed countless combinations of characteristics, creating diverse growth paths for the player. There were common and rare characteristics, but the most powerful of all were the genius ones, which allowed one to reach the peak in a specific area with ease. Normally, it was only possible to choose one of these characteristics. However, in his past life as a player, Nock had managed to select two. Nock focused. It was time to use all his knowledge to choose the path that would lead him not only to survival, but also to revenge. Before him, the system window opened, offering two genius options, one to sense mana and another to master the sword and martial arts. A choice needed to be made. The selection screen appeared, asking him to choose a characteristic, the decision that would define his entire future in this new world. The first option was the genius of the sword and martial arts, a path that would make him a master of physical combat, a warrior without equal. The second was the genius of mana sensitivity, a talent that would transform him into a mage of maximum efficiency with absolute control over magic. Nock pondered the choice. In his previous life as a player, he had both, but now, reincarnated in the character's body, he needed to decide which path to follow. He then remembered the original owner of this body, the real Nock von Reinhofer. The young nobleman was hailed as a prodigy, the center of attention. But behind all that glory, there was a fundamental problem. Our protagonist, with his knowledge of the game, knew that the original Nock's life was a facade about to crumble, and it was exactly in this weakness that he saw an opportunity. A mischievous smile appeared on his face, as he already had a plan in mind. The big secret was a devastating condition. The young nobleman suffered from a terminal illness. And that wasn't all. The status window revealed a list of misfortunes, curses, frequent illnesses, and a weak body. A true walking hospital. Nock gave a wry smile. He had been reincarnated into the most problematic body possible. It was like starting the game on infernal difficulty, but he didn't despair. With the knowledge of 27 playthroughs, he knew that even the worst of curses could be circumvented. The first step was the most important. The original Nock was known for his difficult temperament, which only worsened his situation and alienated everyone. A talent wasted by a terrible personality. But the new Nock was different. He looked at the maid, who was still watching him with fear, and felt the weight of responsibility. He needed to fix everything. Looking at the sky, he made his decision. He would solve all those problems, one at a time, starting with the most debilitating curse. The maid watched Nock walk away, still not understanding the young master's sudden change of attitude. She was genuinely surprised by the determination she saw in his eyes, something that had never existed before. But Nock didn't look back. He had a clear plan in mind and knew exactly where to start. The first step was to go to the family training grounds. There, in front of the gate, he felt the weight and glory of the Reinhafer name. It was time to claim what was rightfully his. The first problem to be solved was the languishing curse, a condition that cut his growth rate in half and made him twice as vulnerable to weaknesses. To overcome it, the solution was to train, but Nock's cursed body could barely lift the training sword. He trembled under the weight, remembering that the former owner of that body was so weak that he couldn't swing the weapon even 10 times. With superhuman effort, he tried to maintain his posture, but the weakness was simply overwhelming. The sword fell from his hands, and Nock collapsed to the ground, completely exhausted after a single attempt. But instead of frustration, he laughed. He laughed at the pathetic situation he was in. The starting point was as low as possible. The training hall was empty, witnessing only his failure. But for the new Nock, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long journey of overcoming. After all, he was in the heart of the Reinhofer family, a lineage whose fame was built on sword mastery and the power of darkness, a legacy he would reclaim. He reflected on the legacy of the Reinhafer family, a power that, theoretically, belonged only to the next head of the family. But he, the useless son, had nothing to do with it. After all, the Reinhafer's strength didn't come only from their swordsmanship. The real power was in the leader's sword, a source of immense influence, and with that influence came many advantages. Nock thought of one of them in particular, an advantage that he, as the youngest and most despised son, could exploit without raising suspicion. The family was so absurdly rich that they could give a generous allowance even to their trash of a youngest son. A smile of pure satisfaction appeared on his face. At that moment, he realized that money was the best tool he had to start his turnaround. They wouldn't even care how Nock spent it. After all, he was known for being the troublesome son who already had everything handed to him. But that reputation would be his greatest weapon. He couldn't simply run away, not before finishing what he had asked Rona to prepare. He remembered the cold look of the family patriarch, a man who saw him as a complete disappointment. But Nock was no longer that weak boy. Inside, he was someone else, with a new determination to claim what was his. His body, however, was still a major obstacle. He could barely stand up, his legs shaking from the effort. Physical weakness was a constant reminder of how long his journey would be. That made him remember the conversation he had with the maid, Rona, a few minutes before. She looked at him suspiciously, wanting to know what he was planning. He had called her, asking her to prepare some items for him in the training hall. On the cart, she brought exactly what he asked for: a wooden sword, a towel, and water, the most basic kit for the beginning of his revenge. Rona, the maid, looked exhausted. Catering to young Master Nock von Reinhofer's whims was always a test of patience, and she was already at her limit. Suddenly, Something in his attitude put her on alert. A chill ran down her spine. Nock then pointed to the cart she had brought and began to give new instructions, but his tone was strangely serious. His gesture was misinterpreted in the worst possible way. In a panic, Rona cowered, thinking he was going to assault her for some imaginary fault. Her reaction only served to irritate Nock. He didn't have time for these dramas. But instead of a blow, his hand moved gently and unexpectedly. He approached and whispered the real request in her ear, something that needed to be kept secret. His words left her completely shocked. It wasn't a threat, but an order so absurd that she could hardly believe it. Nock smiled, pleased with the effect he had caused. For him, it was just the next step in the plan. For Rona, it was an impossible mission. She ran out, thinking that deep down, the young master hadn't changed at all. He was still the same troublesome kid as always. And so, she disappeared. Alone again, Nock turned to the cart. The first part of his plan was in motion. He picked up the jug of water she had left. The minimal effort still weighed on his weak body. As he drank, he enjoyed a rare second of tranquility. Only that peace was abruptly interrupted. An unexpected and unwelcome presence had just entered the hall. The figure who interrupted his peace was Rotwell, the butler and right-hand man of the head of the family. Nock knew that dealing with him would be anything but easy, especially in that moment of weakness. With an impeccable posture, Rotwell conveyed the order he received. The head of the family demanded Nock's presence at dinner that night. The butler wasn't speaking for himself. He was the voice and will of Nock's father, the powerful head of the Reinhover family, a man he served with total loyalty. Nock didn't understand why his father would care about him all of a sudden. His first reaction was simply to ignore the call. Acting with calculated indifference, the young man grabbed a drink from the cart that Rona had left behind. So he gave his answer to the butler, saying he wouldn't attend the dinner. Nock braced himself for the insistence that would follow, maintaining his facade of disinterest. His master acting skills were already in effect, but Rotwell had a trump card. He informed him that the young miss from the Steelenor family was visiting. The butler explained that she came to receive riding lessons, and Nock's absence would enrage the head of the family. The mention of that visit changed everything. Nock forced a smile, realizing he had no way to escape that unwanted invitation. Rotwell watched the young master's sudden change of attitude, analyzing the situation. He wasn't a man who was easily fooled. Nock's absence from training with the important guest would be seen as a great insult. The consequences would be severe. The butler commented that Nock's behavior was strange. The young master, who normally hated sword training, was now in the training hall. With no other option, Nock finally agreed to go. He needed to play the game by the rules, at least for now. Rotwell kept watching Nock, finding his behavior very strange. The young master, who always hated swords, was suddenly in the training hall. Something didn't add up. With a cold attitude, Nock von Reinhofer cut off the conversation. He made it clear that his actions were none of a mere butler's business and that he decided what to do. Nock's sharp response only confirmed Rotwell's suspicions. The butler realized that something was really wrong and decided he needed to report this to the head of the family immediately. The young master's insolence was a dangerous sign. Rotwell knew that his loyalty was to the head of the family, and this information needed to reach him as quickly as possible. Nock noticed the change in the butler's expression and questioned himself internally. Had Rotwell noticed something? That look wasn't that of a simple servant. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. A subtle power game where Nock tried to maintain his facade while the butler analyzed his every move. The mention of the young miss from the Steelenor family caught him by surprise. It was an event that shouldn't be happening, something completely outside of his plans and prior knowledge. Rotwell noticed Knock's reaction, but said nothing. He just watched, collecting more information for his report. Every detail confirmed that the young master was hiding something big. With a formal bow, Rotwell said goodbye. The conversation was over, but the butler's investigation was just beginning. He already had what he needed. Alone again, Knock stared at the gate. The secret of his transmigration was his greatest asset and his greatest weakness. If anyone found out, all would be lost. Before leaving, the butler took one last look back. That boy was definitely not the same Knock he knew anymore. The change was too drastic to ignore. Time passed, and the hour of the dreaded dinner finally arrived. An event that Knock couldn't avoid, not with such an important guest present. In the main mansion of the Reinhofer family, the atmosphere was one of formality and tension. All the important family members were gathered, and Knock was about to enter the snake pit. Despite the facade of indifference he was trying to maintain, the pressure of the moment was real. Knock knew that his every word and gesture would be judged that night. As soon as he entered, the venomous whispers began. Members of his own family called him trash, commenting on how he was ruining the environment and accusing him of being shameless. The accusations hit him hard. He knew he wasn't that person anymore, but the injustice of being judged for the mistakes of another body, of another life, was overwhelming. The malicious comments didn't stop. They accused him of assaulting servants, of being a complete scoundrel, painting a portrait of a man Knock was striving not to be. And in the midst of that hostile environment, the guest of honor watched everything in silence. Thalia von Steelenor, the young miss whose presence was the reason for this whole circus. Inside the imposing Reinhofer mansion, the dinner proceeded, an event that should have been welcoming, but for Knock, it was a real battlefield. Night fell over the residence, but the tension inside was darker than the sky itself. Every moment felt like an eternity. Sitting at the table, Knock felt an enormous weight. It was a feeling of deep injustice, being blamed for acts he didn't commit, for a life that wasn't his. He tried to shut himself off from the outside world, seeking a moment of peace in the midst of the chaos, but the provocation was far from over. On the other side of the table, his twin brothers, Hatch and Alan, began to provoke him openly. They mocked him, questioning why he still clung to a family that clearly despised him. The mockery echoed through the dining room, making Knock's position in that family clear, an isolated target, an outcast in his own home. The two continued, enjoying their brother's discomfort. For them, it was just cheap entertainment at Knock's expense. Knock, however, remained silent. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. His indifference was the only weapon he had at that moment. But the focus of the night was about to change. The main door opened, and everyone's attention turned to the entrance. The servants bowed in reverence, announcing the arrival of an important figure. The atmosphere of mockery was suddenly interrupted. Sitting at the head of the table was the head of the family, Theo von Reinhofer. His gaze was imposing, and his presence silenced anyone. Knock watched the scene, forcing a slight smile. The real ordeal of the night was just beginning. Now, he would have to deal with all of them. After the patriarch's arrival, he introduced the guest of honor for the evening, Thalia von Steelenor, who greeted everyone with a radiant smile. The family head formally introduced her. Despite her apparent cordiality, the tension in the room was palpable, especially coming from the patriarch. Knock's twin brothers, however, saw the guest's arrival as a new opportunity to continue their taunts. Knock recognized her instantly. It was Thalia, a crucial character in the original story and a figure he could never forget. He knew exactly who she was and the role she would play in the future. In his past life, Thalia was the person who condemned him. Knock knew that if he didn't change the course of history, she would be responsible for his ruin once again. Ignoring the tension between his sons, Theo von Reinhaver went straight to the main point of that dinner. Nock already imagined what was coming next. That announcement was the real reason he had been summoned to that infernal meeting. Thalia also listened attentively, her expression now serious and unreadable. Her presence there was definitely not a coincidence. The subject was Ilidian Academy, the most important place in the world. It was there that cadets were trained to fight demons in all kinds of unexpected situations within the game known as Inner Lunatic. The twins could barely contain their satisfaction. For them, the decision about who would go to the academy had already been made, and the spots were theirs by right. Nock was confused by his brother's attitude. He didn't understand where so much certainty came from. One of the brothers then addressed their father, saying that it was time to make a decision about who would be admitted to the academy. Whoever was chosen would become the family's new talent. Nock listened to everything in silence, knowing that, in everyone's eyes there, he was not a candidate. Theo von Reinhaver pondered for a moment. The decision he was about to announce would change the future of the family and the fate of his sons. Ilidian Academy was the most important place on the entire continent, an elite institution where only the most promising could dream of entering. Within the world of the game Inner Lunatic, the Academy was the main stage where the story unfolded and heroes were forged. Nock listened to everything, feeling the pressure of the conversation. He knew that, in theory, he had no chance of being chosen. Only the most powerful and influential nobles managed to get a spot, and the competition between families was absolutely brutal. Seated at the table, Theo finally broke the silence and began to explain the situation to everyone present. He revealed that each noble family received only 3 admission tickets to the academy, a rule created to limit their power. Nock's father continued, stating that he had already used 2 spots for his older sons. Therefore, for the Reinhaver family, only a single ticket remained. For Nock, getting that admission ticket was the best, if not the only, way to change his destiny. It was his gateway to a new future. And that's when the young man noticed a gap, a small opportunity arising in the middle of that tense dinner. Theo announced that he would choose the candidate according to the family tradition, which left the twins visibly satisfied. The tradition was simple. The brothers would have to fight each other. Upon hearing this, Nock understood that this was the chance he needed to prove his worth. The father set the rules. The date of the duel would be set for a month from now, and he would decide who would be admitted after seeing them fight on the training ground. And he finished with a serious warning. If any of them were thinking of giving up, they better speak up now. The twin brothers couldn't contain themselves and burst out laughing. For them, the competition had already been won, and the idea of fighting Nock was a joke. While the brothers laughed, Thalia watched the scene, surprised by Nock's reaction. He, in turn, seemed completely indifferent to the mockery, as if he were in his own world. Ignoring everyone, Nock simply picked up a glass of wine. He took a sip, savoring the moment and treating the brothers' provocation as mere background noise. Nock's attitude was the last straw for one of the twins, who exploded with rage. He shouted that this duel was his only chance to enter the academy and he would not be disrespected, but the threats had no effect whatsoever. Nock just looked up, staring at his brother with a cold and unexpected confidence, which silenced everyone for a moment. And then, he smiled. Nock made it clear that he would not listen to their ridiculous notions and that he would be the only one admitted to the academy. His confidence was absolute. Their father, Theo, watched everything in silence. He commented to Thalia about the sudden self-confidence of his youngest son, visibly intrigued by the change. The twin brothers were furious. Nock's calmness was the greatest insult they could receive, and they didn't know how to react to that silent affront. Thalia, however, was enjoying the situation. The unexpected twist and the tension in the air left her genuinely entertained. The scene was a complete contrast. On one side, the twins in shock and fury. On the other, Nock, serene, as if he already knew the outcome of that confrontation. Later that night, Nock reflected on his actions. He knew that, with his new attitude, he had just drawn the attention of someone he probably shouldn't have. And he was right. In his office, Theo was receiving a report from his assistant, Rotwell. The subject was precisely the sudden change in Nock's behavior. Rotwell confirmed that he himself wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. It seemed that the young master had had a sudden and inexplicable personality change. Theo listened to every word, pondering the information. His youngest son's transformation was, to say the least, intriguing and needed to be watched closely. The change was so drastic that the father even wondered if Nock wasn't being possessed by a demon. Something very strange was happening in the Reinhafer family, and indeed, the family's eyes were already on him. Rotwell, the assistant, was tasked with observing every step of the young master, trying to understand that sudden change. Theo's order was clear and direct. Constant surveillance of Nock was necessary. Meanwhile, in the training grounds, Nock was pushing himself to the limit, taking his body to its absolute extreme. His attitude soon caught the attention of the maids, who gossiped about the upcoming competition and didn't understand the young lord's training method. To them, it seemed like a pointless effort. He was just running in circles, day after day. Nock noticed the looks and whispers, but tried to ignore them. He had a much bigger problem to solve. His biggest obstacle at that moment was his own physical strength, or rather, the complete lack of it. He needed to overcome this weakness at any cost, no matter how painful and exhausting the process was. While a normal person would progress with common training, for Nock, the story was quite different. The exhaustion was so great that tears streamed down, but he smiled. Every drop of sweat was a step in the right direction, even if it was a tiny step. Still, the satisfaction of having given his all was greater than the pain he felt. The reason for so much effort was the languishing curse, a terrible condition that reduced his physical growth by half, making any progress an epic battle. But Nock wasn't killing himself for nothing. He had a plan, and the key piece was an item he had just received. He looked at the book in his hands. If normal training didn't work, he would have to use a shortcut, an ancient method to achieve the power he needed. The next day, the items Nock had ordered arrived, arranged on a service table. They were the ingredients for his risky shortcut. A maid approached, announcing that she had brought what the young master requested. Nock greeted her with a satisfied smile. His plan was about to begin. On the table, there was a collection of dangerous items, a golem core, a growth scroll, and, to the maid's surprise, snake venom. Without hesitating, the young man picked up one of the ingredients, confident in his choice. The maid was confused. Almost all of the items were poisonous or dangerous remedies that anyone in their right mind would avoid. She thought that, apart from the scroll, none of that seemed useful. The young woman watched Nock with growing concern, not understanding the purpose of such a bizarre request. But Nock knew exactly what he was doing, and that's when the maid realized his intention, becoming completely shocked. He picked up the vial containing the three-headed snake venom, and, to the young woman's despair, he drank it all at once. She panicked, not believing what she was seeing. He had just taken poison. The poison took effect instantly. Nock felt the pain run through his body, confirming that it was, in fact, lethal. But amid the agony, there was a glimmer of determination in his gaze. The pain was just the first step in his plan. With the poison running through his veins, Nock grabbed onto the first support he found, enduring the pain with all his strength. But there was no time to succumb. He reached for the next item, the core of a golem. Without hesitation, he consumed the core, and to his surprise, it even tasted good. He felt the effect almost immediately. The combination of the poison with the core was working exactly as he predicted. The golem core, an item used to create artificial golems, had a secondary effect on humans, temporary petrification to increase defenses, and with that combination, Nock managed to nullify the curse that afflicted him. The first obstacle was overcome. The maid, still in a panic, asked if the young master was okay, not understanding anything that was happening, but Nock ignored her, starting to unbutton his shirt. He wasn't finished yet. While the maid called out to him, desperate, a system notification appeared. Everything was going as planned. Before the terrified young woman, Nock grabbed the next item from the tray, fairy spring water. He poured the liquid over himself. The special water would increase his stamina growth rate, compensating for the penalty of his terminal illness. The sensation was invigorating. With this, he not only got rid of the curse, but also compensated for the physical growth penalty it caused. And then, something unexpected happened. The system announced that a hidden piece had been discovered, temporarily granting him the characteristic Blessed Growth. The new skill doubled his growth rate until his stamina reached a certain level. The risk had been well worth it, but Nock's plan was even more ambitious. With the curse removed and his growth doubled, he prepared for the final step. With the curse removed, Nock used a scroll to begin the final phase of his plan, confident that everything would work out. He felt his own neck, checking the changes in his body. The sensation was strange, but good. He was finally free. With his body invigorated and his mind focused, Nock clenched his fist. His determination for what was to come was total. Suddenly, one of the mansion's maids collided with him, completely desperate. The young woman was in a panic, thinking Nock was unwell. She asked if he needed help or if she should call the butler. Caught by surprise, Nock barely had time to react to the girl's despair, who was holding him tightly. The maid was on the verge of tears, not understanding why the young master was subjecting himself to something so dangerous. But Nock just smiled. He said that, since he had managed to get rid of the curse, he would let her interruption pass this time. He tried to give her a reassuring smile, but the newfound confidence seemed almost arrogant. The girl remained in shock, unable to process the sudden and inexplicable improvement in her master's condition. Nock stared at her with a calmness she had never seen. This was no longer the weak and sick young man she knew. He was feeling good. In fact, he was feeling great, ready to really start. And that's when he realized, with his body healed and his growth doubled, there wasn't a second to lose. Without further explanation, Nock took off running. The real training had just begun. To anyone looking from the outside, it just looked like a young man running aimlessly through the mansion's courtyard. From afar, a young woman watched Nock's unusual training, completely skeptical. Thalia couldn't help herself and commented to her maid that the youngest son of the Rheinhafers was weak, refused to learn fencing, and thought that just running would solve anything. The maid, Emma, tried to be more thoughtful, but Thalia was convinced that in a month, Nock would be completely crushed by his older brothers. Even with all this certainty, something bothered her. A worry that she couldn't explain made her suddenly get up. She decided she couldn't just stand by and watch. She told Emma that she would be out for a moment and headed towards the courtyard to intervene personally. Meanwhile, other members of the house also watched the scene, not understanding what the young master was trying to do. However, as she approached Nock, his reaction was not at all what she expected. The boy's cold and indifferent attitude caught her completely by surprise, leaving her a little embarrassed. Even Emma, who was accompanying her, was shocked by the unexpected situation. But Thalia wasn't one to back down. She stepped forward, determined to make him listen to her. She found him in the middle of the mansion's courtyard. Her shadow stretched across the ground, reaching him. Nock, who was sitting down catching his breath, looked up, surprised by the figure who was now standing right in front of him. With a confident smile, she formally introduced herself as Thalia, perhaps thinking that her beauty had left him speechless. But Nock's expression was just one of calm and curiosity. He didn't seem at all intimidated by the swordswoman who interrupted his training. Nock could barely stand from exhaustion. Before him, Thalia waited for a reaction, any reaction, but got nothing. The young man's total indifference caught her completely by surprise. She simply wasn't used to being ignored like that. In her mind, there was only one possible explanation. He must be so shocked by her beauty that he was speechless. It was the only thing that made sense. So she decided to break the silence, questioning whether he really believed that running in circles would help him beat his older brothers. Nock's answer, however, was short and direct. He said he wasn't interested and asked her to leave him alone. From afar, the maid accompanying Thalia watched the scene unfold, seeming to agree with her mistress's assessment of Nock's training. Thalia tried to hide her irritation with a forced laugh, commenting that boys shouldn't talk to ladies like that. But Nock didn't even raise his head. His indifference was the greatest offense she could receive at that moment, and that was the last straw. Thalia's composure finally crumbled. She couldn't believe that after offering to help, she was being treated like that. Her frustration exploded into words. Losing her patience completely, Thalia grabbed him by the arm, forcing him to pay attention to her. But the moment she touched him, an information window appeared before Nock's eyes, revealing Thalia's complete profile, and her charm attribute was very high. He analyzed the data and realized it instantly. Despite her arrogant attitude, the girl's talent was undeniable. Her stats were impressive for her age, but that wasn't all. Nock saw a fragment of the future, a terrible vision where Thalia's firepower would evolve into a white flame, used to incinerate him. He understood the risk. If he turned Thalia into an ally now, he would be deviating from the main story, and any deviation could mean his own death. He needed to follow the script. Nock saw the future in a flash. The vision showed the power of Thalia's flame, which would one day evolve into the white flame, a force used to incinerate him to death. He pondered the situation. Making Thalia an ally now could completely mess up the future he knew, deviating from the main story, and to avoid death, he needed to stay as close as possible to the original script. Any deviation was a risk he simply couldn't take. After all, what would be the point of allying with the person who, in the future, would be responsible for taking his life? The decision was made. He couldn't afford to make a wrong move in this dangerous game for survival. With his mind made up, Nock knew exactly what he needed to do next. A month passed. During this time, Thalia had dedicated herself intensely to her own fencing training, and apparently, her progress was attracting everyone's attention. The instructors praised her, impressed with how quickly she learned. They said she possessed a talent worthy of the great Steelenor family. The recognition was genuine, but for Thalia, those words seemed empty. She reflected on the praise. Talent worthy of the Steelenor family. Was that what really mattered? Her eyes revealed an ambition that went far beyond simple applause. There was a much bigger goal in her mind. The memory of a crushing defeat still haunted her. A duel against her own sister, where she ended up on the ground, disarmed and completely humiliated. That moment defined her path. All the training, all the dedication wasn't for the family name. It was to one day overcome that humiliation. To become a knight, the path began and ended with the sword. It was a silent oath, a commitment made even before any real battle. A young woman with red hair reflected on the true meaning of this path. What, in fact, defined a knight? The ideal image was clear: an individual who lived with simplicity, driven not by greed, but by a greater purpose of sacrificing themselves in the name of justice. However, she doubted that someone who focused only on physical training could really achieve that ideal. The conclusion in her mind was inevitable and cruel. He would never be able to overcome his brothers, who had trained their techniques their whole lives. And then, the day of the duel arrived. At the Reinhafer family mansion, everything was prepared for the event that would decide the future of the young men. The morning sun shone on the place. The stage was set not for a celebration, but for a competition that would define everything. The dispute for the spot at the prestigious Elidian Academy was about to begin. In the center of the hall, Nock von Reinhofer stood before his brother. The tension was palpable, with all the servants of the house watching in silence. From a box, the family watched, each with their own judgment and expectations about what was about to happen. Priscilla, the first wife, maintained a cold and distant expression. Her gaze didn't show any favoritism, just a critical analysis. Beside her, a stern-looking man analyzed the scene with an air of superiority, as if the outcome was already obvious to him. And at the center of it all, the patriarch of the Reinhofer family watched in silence. His imposing posture made it clear that his word was the final law in that house. The man with the monocle seemed to have made up his mind. To him, this duel was just a formality, a spectacle with a winner already decided. Nock's brother then spoke, questioning the spectators' opinion about the duel. His confidence was so great that he treated the fight as mere entertainment. The duel began under the watchful eyes of the Reinhafer family. Nock stood against his opponent while the instructor prepared to give the starting signal. At that moment, the tension was visible on Nock's face. This was the moment of truth, the chance to prove that everything had changed. Without hesitation, the opponent lunged forward with an aerial attack, seeking a quick and decisive victory to end the fight before it even began. The battle that would define his future had begun, and every move would be crucial to rewriting his history of failures. Meanwhile, at the balcony, the family leader asked Rotwell what his opinion was about the unfolding confrontation. Rotwell was honest. He admitted that, despite the young master Knox having changed, he had no impression that he would be able to win. The man next to him agreed, stating that the idea of a Knock victory was outrageous and simply impossible. The patriarch, however, reflected that the outcome of a fight is not always decided only by training time. Sometimes it was the simplest thing in the world. Priscilla, the first wife, watched the scene in silence while the discussion about Knock's potential continued. The advisor explained that the only thing that could overcome years of experience was a natural talent, a true genius from another world. And the question that hung in the air was whether Knock, the young master known for his weakness, was born with that kind of overwhelming gift. The memories of his past defeats still haunted him. The humiliation of being completely subdued was a wound that had not healed. But that pain became his greatest fuel. The calloused and bandaged hands were proof that he had trained tirelessly to change his destiny. Only suddenly, the expressions on the balcony changed. The certainty of Knock's defeat gave way to complete and utter shock. And down there, the reason for the surprise was revealed. Knock was no longer cornered. On the contrary, a confident smile showed that the game had just turned. One of the family's instructors watched Knock's training with some apprehension, not understanding the logic behind that method. He seemed skeptical about the results that such a raw and seemingly meaningless effort could bring to the young master. In another corner, an older nobleman just watched everything in silence, with a calculating and indecipherable look. Meanwhile, Nok could barely stand. The sweat and exhaustion were the price of his desperate effort to get stronger. And then, the system responded. A notification informed him that his stamina had increased by a measly 0.1. The young man panted, feeling every muscle ache. The progress was slow, almost insignificant, but it was still progress. Only he wasn't suffering alone on this journey. His personal maid, who was running beside him, begged for a break, questioning whether he really needed to continue with that. With an amused air, Nok gave the excuse that he needed someone to assist him during training. He pulled her by the hand, making it clear that the torture session was far from over. The young woman had no choice but to accept her fate, even reluctantly. She pouted, clearly annoyed with the whole situation. Nok, on the other hand, seemed to be having a lot of fun with her reaction. But suddenly, his smile disappeared. He had an idea and decided to check something. Using his ability, he checked the maid's stats and was shocked. Her stamina was 4.5, an absurdly high number for a simple servant. Nok could barely process the information, the stats he barely achieved with a month of hard work. The maid had plenty of. He wondered how that was possible, while the young woman, confused, didn't understand anything. She noticed the sudden change in his behavior and questioned him, but Nok was lost in his own thoughts. He looked at the sky and realized that time was up. Night was already falling, and the competition he had been preparing for was about to begin. Moments later, Nok was already in the arena. Before him, his opponent, and on the balconies above, the entire Reinhafer family watched, awaiting the start of the duel. One of his brothers, Alain, approached with a smug smile on his face. Alain said that even though Nok was the disgrace of the family, he was still his younger brother, so he promised not to hit too hard. A clear taunt. He then revealed that he just wanted to look cool in front of the young lady of the Steelenor family, who was also watching the confrontation. The revelation only increased the pressure on Nok, who already felt like he was on the edge. While Alain asked if he was also interested in the lady, Nok used his skill and saw his brother's status. Stamina, 8. He realized that there was no way he could win by normal means. From above, one of the family elders spoke to formalize the combat. He declared that the duel between Nok and his other brother, Nox, would decide who would have the right to enter a Lydian academy, and that both should accept the result. Nok knew that if he lost there, it would all be over. His chance to recover his memories and discover the truth about his life would come to an end. With the weight of the world on his shoulders, he held the hilt of his sword firmly. His opponent, Nox, seemed surprised by the heavy atmosphere that had formed. Then, the signal was given. The elder shouted for them to start, and Nox advanced immediately with the first blow. Nox's first blow was quick and brutal, forcing Nok to dodge by a hair to avoid being cut in half. He landed firmly, regaining his balance for the next move. Nok knew that this fight was all or nothing. If he won there, he felt that he would be able to conquer anything and finally understand his past. With that determination, the young man prepared for the counterattack. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready for action. Nox, however, mocked his brother's seriousness. He asked if the blows had made him stupid and if he needed to be hit more to regain his senses. The exchange of blows really began, with the swords clashing at an impressive speed before the spectators. But Nok immediately realized that something was wrong. Nox's strength was much greater than he imagined, and the pressure was overwhelming. His brother smiled arrogantly, feeling victory getting closer and closer. From afar, one of the older brothers watched with clear disappointment. He had heard that Nok had changed, but was that the best he could do? The impact of the next blow was brutal, completely unbalancing Nok. A woman, the matriarch of the family, watched everything with a cold expression, while a servant asked if he should interrupt the fight to avoid serious injuries. Nox gave no respite, advancing with a wild smile to finish the duel. The matriarch continued watching. Nox's style was the rule of the Black Sword Force, which subjugated opponents with overwhelming power. She wondered who in the world would be able to face him. The family servant watched the scene, deeply worried. He knew that if the fight continued like that, young Master Nock would need a long time to recover. The matriarch, however, displayed a slight smile. She seemed satisfied with the demonstration of power she was witnessing. The servant recognized that Nock's talent was good, but compared to the firstborn, his skills were still far inferior. The difference in power was obvious. Nock was on the ground, panting, appearing to have reached his limit. But suddenly, he turned with a wild smile on his face. Nox provoked, asking if he was already exhausted, but Nock's expression said otherwise. That was the power of the rule of the Black Sword Force, an overwhelming technique made to bring any opponent to their knees with pure brute force. Despite the defiant attitude, Nock's body was clearly exhausted. Seeing this, the servant felt immense relief, believing that the duel was finally over. He even suggested that they stop there. The tension was so great that the man collapsed into the chair, exhausted just from watching. But in the next instant, something changed completely. A system notification popped up. The sword and martial arts genius trait had been activated. Nock's fatigue seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a renewed energy and a confidence he didn't have before. He wasn't finished. In fact, it seemed like he was just getting started. And then, a new skill was invoked, the Genius Time Flow. The eyes of those watching widened in shock. They said that geniuses and ordinary people lived in different times, and at that very moment, Nock was about to show what that really meant. The observers in the stands couldn't believe what they were seeing. The turnaround was so sudden that it left them completely speechless. The opponent, still confident, advanced with his sword, not understanding the true nature of Nock's new ability. To him, nothing had changed. But for Nock, the entire world had slowed down. The Genius Time Flow ability distorted his perception, making every enemy movement seem like slow motion. What seemed like an impossibly fast movement to others was just a calculated step for Nock. He wasn't moving faster, he was perceiving time differently. The opponent put all his strength into the blow, believing it would be the end of the fight. But Nock was already in position, holding the sword with a firmness he never had before. The sword genius was in control now, and every move was simply perfect. And then he attacked. A torrent of blows that the opponent could barely keep up with. The fight, which seemed decided, turned upside down in the blink of an eye. The young opponent couldn't understand. The boy who was exhausted a second ago now moved like a master. Despair began to take over. With one last move, Nock declared the fight won. He had shocked everyone, showing a power that no one imagined. But this victory could have a much higher cost than he thought.